Ukraine's counteroffensive has been the talk of the media and the talk of many military experts and armchair generals alike, as well as those self-proclaimed experts on Twitter who go around tweeting about anything they don't know about. With all the media attention Ukraine's potential counteroffensive is getting, I think it's very important that we jump into a few things that will affect Ukraine's counteroffensive, could turn it into a massive success or an absolute total failure. This offensive could be D-Day or Operation Market Garden. In other words, victory or absolute defeat. And it's really all dependent on one major element that Ukraine needs right now. We're going to be discussing multiple facets, what the Ukrainians will require for a successful offensive, and why if they don't get what's required, it will be an absolute disaster. Now here's the thing, before we jump into this, I want to make a few things perfectly clear. I've never served in the military, I've never been at the Pentagon's planning room, or anything like that. I'm not an actual military soldier, however, I have studied war for the better portion of around 8 years. And so I know a little bit about warfare and the way it goes and how successful operations are supposed to go and what they require to move forward. But I am taking the facts as they are and compiling them into this presentation to help you have a better understanding about what's about to happen in Ukraine within the next few weeks. Before we get into our deep dive, I want to make something very, very clear. I'm going to be discussing primarily principles of warfare. This is something very crucial for all the viewers to understand. This presentation in no way will reflect your feelings or your opinions about who should win and what should happen. This is going to present the facts of warfare, the principles of warfare, and from that, we will attempt to determine what will happen in the future. There are so many people who it seems as if they have traveled to Russia and Ukraine, given their hearts to Zelensky and Putin, and allowed any victory or defeat to mess with their mind. And therefore, they get all triggered when you say something they may not like. Sometimes reality hurts, and we're going to be discussing reality on here. Now, for most of the viewers, I know that won't be a problem because most of the viewers of this channel like facts and like the information. But the few outliers out there who are over here just trying to get an emotional pickup, this probably isn't the presentation for you, so you might want to leave. Without further ado, let's jump into this. Let's start off with the principles of modern warfare. Typically, principles do not change in procedure, but they change in form over time. For example, when Sun Tzu said appear strong when you're weak, that may have meant having 7,000 cannons in the Revolutionary War time period. But just because you're following Sun Tzu's principle doesn't mean you would bring 7,000 cannons to 2023 attempting to appear strong when you're weak. No, you would replace that with 7,000 tanks or 7,000 artillery pieces. So that's what I mean. The principle appear strong when you're weak is a solid principle, but it may change form as the centuries and decades go by. And the principles of modern warfare are pretty basic and can be learned pretty fast if you're observing modern conflicts with an open mind. So in modern warfare, one of the best ways to actually win a conflict and to win it fast is combined arms warfare. Essentially, we're having all branches of the armed forces, the Air Force, the Navy, and Army, working together rapidly and effectively to accomplish one goal. This is something absolutely foreign to many militaries in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. However, it is the literal lifeblood of the United States military, and that's the reason America is the military superpower it is today. In any armed forces, you have the ground forces, the Navy, and the Air Force. In most conflicts today, the Navy does not play a major role, or as major of a role as it used to in prior centuries. The main two components of modern warfare are the Air Force and the ground forces. In other words, the Army. So it is essential for any country who wants to win a war to make sure they have a good ground forces, good Air Force. The Navy can be good as well, but you want to focus on those primary two branches of your armed forces. Now, everybody knows you're supposed to have a strong army. That's kind of a given. I mean, when people think of warfare, they typically think of troops moving amongst armored columns of tanks and armored fighting vehicles, along with the sound of artillery fire behind them. That's typically what people think. So having a strong army, a strong ground forces is a given in the minds of most people and the minds of most militaries. However, many people neglect the Air Force. You may have seen the memes about the Air Force being soft, the people in the Air Force being soft. If you're on TikTok or you're on YouTube, you'll see a lot of memes about the Air Force kind of being a joke, at least the airmen. And while it's funny to make jokes about the Air Force, it's also critical to realize their irreplaceable value to victory on the modern battlefield. If you can't control your skies with jets, someone else will control your skies with their jets. And therefore, air power is extremely important. The Air Force can determine who wins or loses a war. To illustrate this point, let's examine a quote by Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill said, "Not to have an adequate Air Force in the present state of the world is to compromise the foundations of national freedom and independence." And for those of you who think that only applied to the 1940s, that is not true. The nations of Iraq and Serbia both learned this lesson the hard way. When you do not control your skies or do not possess the ability to, someone else will control your skies, and the army that controls the skies tends to get their boots on your soil. And pretty soon, they take over your country. Not in all, but in most cases. To help you understand this more, I want to examine some of the conflicts the United States and many Western countries have been in the recent decades to help you see the importance of air power in the modern world. Now, disclaimer before we jump into this video. The conflicts I am about to name, I am not taking a side over. If you're from the countries that were involved in this conflict, I'm not trying to be disrespectful to your country in any way. Nor am I taking any sides, as I understand that conflicts are rarely a case of absolute good versus absolute evil. I'm simply taking historical events and retrieving lessons we can learn from them about modern warfare, especially the war in Ukraine. So, let's travel back to 1999. In 1999, there was a bloody and famous war between the ethnic Albanians of Kosovo and the Serbians under the command of Slobodan Milosevic. He was the leader of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which was loved by everybody, wasn't it? This war was fierce and bloody, and as usual, the world's only hero with the best intentions for humanity had to step into the picture to end the conflict. Jokes aside, the United States did step into the conflict with many of their allies to aid the situation. You understand what I'm saying, right? The intervention in Serbia had absolutely nothing to do with any sort of political interest, only to liberate the oppressed people in that region. You can't actually imagine a scenario where the United States would intervene with military force against a country for any financial personal gain, could you? No, of course not. It's only to help people. But anyway, into the war. The United States did intervene with their allies against the Yugoslav government. This war, which turned into a 2.5-month NATO victory, could have lasted much longer than that and turned to heavy NATO casualties had it not been for the United States Air Force. And here's where I'll begin illustrating the power air forces can have to determine the destiny of a conflict. Now, before NATO actually began the main phase of this operation, innocently known as Operation Noble Anvil, NATO considered a ground attack against the Yugoslav government. And that's not hard to conceive. I mean, the United States Armed Forces are on a totally different class than Serbia ever was or ever could be. And I'm pretty sure there's not an element of doubt in anybody's head that the United States Army could easily smash Serbia. In fact, General Wesley Clark, Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, was quote-unquote convinced that planning and preparations for ground intervention, in particular, pushed Milosevic to concede. And while General Clark, I'm pretty sure, had the best of intentions and was totally honest in his assessment, the actual action that took place against the Yugoslav government was done almost solely by the air forces of NATO. And I'm just going to assume the NATO Air Forces was what forced the Yugoslav government to capitulate, because typically kinetic energy persuades people more than cheap talk. Now, during the NATO action against Yugoslavia, France and Germany had vigorously opposed a ground offensive. French estimates suggested that an invasion would need an army of 500,000 troops to achieve success. Yugoslavia had a massive army. They sucked in their equipment, sucked in their training, and probably sucked in about every element an army can suck in, but they had numbers on their side. I mean, even if you're a great boxer, the top in your class, you could be an expert at boxing. You could be the deadliest fighter in your city. But if you have to come up against 15 or 20 quote-unquote sucky other boxers, you might want to bring 2 or 3 of your friends, because extreme skill can still be subdued by extreme numbers. That being said, the estimated required NATO force of 500,000 troops to achieve success, totally unattainable by most NATO countries. This left NATO, particularly the United States, with a clear view that a land operation had no support. Only America could actually pull 500,000 troops. Aside from the United States, no one else was particularly fond of this ground force invasion idea. And with that being said, the reluctance of NATO to use ground forces cast serious doubt on the idea that Milosevic capitulated out of fear of a land invasion. Remember our friend General Wesley Clark? Yeah, he was probably wrong. With a ground invasion not in the cards, NATO resorted to an air campaign, a brutal yet ruthlessly effective air campaign to subdue the Yugoslav government. The campaign involved 1,000 aircraft operating in air bases from Italy to Germany. During the 10 weeks of the conflict, NATO aircraft flew over 38,000 combat missions. They destroyed everything from bridges to tanks to buildings. I mean, they even bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. They literally only lost 2 jets. They lost 2 jet fighters and 2 helicopters. That's it. And according to a Serbian estimate on the economic losses as a result of the conflict, they were able to inflict $29.6 billion worth of damage on the Serbians. And according to NATO, destroying 120 tanks, 220 APCs, 450 artillery pieces, and 121 aircraft. And in that heap of destruction, they also tossed any Yugoslav hopes of victory. Such an insane victory in such a fast time frame illustrates the power a superior air force can have. And a global hegemon or global power does not necessarily need to put ground troops on another country's territory to force them into submission. When you control the sky, you control the war, in most cases. And if you think the Yugoslav government learned this the hard way, wait till you see Saddam Hussein's Iraq. In the early 1990s, Iraq's Saddam Hussein was having a brilliant conversation, likely with himself, in which he was convinced to launch an invasion of Kuwait. Because as a dictator, Saddam Hussein did not like to hear opposing viewpoints, he likely presented the idea to himself, agreed with the idea himself, and began putting the idea into action himself. Regardless of the formulation of this plan, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and this prompted absolute total sympathy from the freedom-loving Bush administration. Once again, Bush was on a mission to liberate the oppressed peoples of the Middle East. Trust me, it had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that Kuwait is one of the most oil-rich countries on the planet. It had nothing to do with that. All morals here. No self-interest, no self-interest. Regardless of intentions, the United States responded with sheer military force, building together a coalition of 39 countries, totaling 956,600 coalition troops, with 700,000 of those being United States soldiers, facing an Iraqi army of 650,000. The coalition had the tech, the coalition had the training, the coalition had the ability, and they probably would have won anyway, but it would not have been nearly this one-sided. By the time the dust settled at the end of the operation, the coalition had lost 292 soldiers killed, compared to 20 to 50,000 Iraqi troops killed. The coalition suffered 31 tanks destroyed or disabled, compared to 3,300 Iraqi tanks. This extremely one-sided operation, this one-sided coalition victory, was made possible mainly, almost solely, by the Air Force. In fact, in one of the war's great stories, the 48th Tactical Fighter Wing Provisional flew 2,500 combat sorties, dropping 7.3 million pounds of precision-guided munitions. The Wing's F-111 fleet destroyed 920 tanks and armored personnel carriers, 245 hardened aircraft shelters, 160 bridges, and in one of the last missions of the war, on February 27, 1991, the 48th recorded the first ever employment of the GBU-28, successfully destroying an Iraq command and control center. All of this wing accomplished without one combat loss of a pilot or aircraft. Did you just hear what was said? This air unit was able to destroy 920 tanks and armored personnel carriers, 113 bunkers, and they did not lose one pilot or aircraft. Do you know how that's possible? Because the coalition had air superiority. He who controls the skies controls the battle. Now, with this new information, it can seem almost hopeless for countries who do not have a big air force. I mean, come on, air jets are pretty expensive. It's not like Bulgaria can just start pumping out F-35s if they decide to. So how does one country maintain safety or maintain some kind of combative edge against another who has a larger air force? Trust me, there's a way. The early stages of the Ukraine war were a case study on how a country with a comparatively pathetic air force can hold off another country whose air force is almost 20 times larger. How is this possible? Air defense. We were just talking about a quote by Winston Churchill, right? Well, here's another thing he said about the Air Force. The power of an Air Force is terrific when there is nothing to oppose it. And there you have the key to success against the Air Force. Good air defense. If a country can maintain a good air defense, it is possible for them to hold off an enemy air force. If you have no air defense and you're fighting an opponent with an even moderately good air force, you're walking into a gladiator fight against a guy with a sword, and yet you have no shield. The quote of Winston Churchill proves it. The power of an air force is terrific when there is nothing to oppose it. A perfect example of this is the early stages of the Ukraine war. On the first day of the Ukraine war, the Russian Air Force launched multiple sorties and different attacks all over Ukraine. But it soon became evident that the Russians did not have air superiority over the skies of Ukraine. In other words, they didn't control the skies, therefore they could not shape the battlefield in the most optimal way. And the reason for this is actually quite hilarious. You see, the Ukrainians didn't have a lot, but they did the best with what they had. So here's basically what happened. Russian aircraft swarmed Ukraine, and at first had mild success. However, they quickly came into contact with their own technology, and the Russians found out very fast that their technology works pretty well against them. And so it wasn't long before we began to see pictures of Russian aircraft being downed all over the skies of Ukraine. You see, after the Soviet Union fell, Russia inherited the majority of the Soviet Union's military hardware. But the country that received the second highest percentage of hardware was Ukraine. Ukraine was a major player in the Soviet Union, and therefore they inherited a large large percentage of military hardware, and this was used against the Russians. So the Russians came up with a brilliant idea. I'm assuming this is how the idea was formulated in the Russian high command. Hey, we can't fly high over the Ukrainian skies because we're getting intercepted by S-300 missiles. We're losing a lot of aircraft and we're looking really bad. So here's the idea. Let's start flying our aircraft low to avoid the air defense. Brilliant, brilliant. The only problem is the Ukrainians had man pads. So these Russian aircraft, which were forced to fly low to operate normally, as soon as they flew low, were hit by Ukrainian man pads. Man pads is an acronym. It stands for Man Portable Air Defense System, meaning a human being takes its air defense system and shoots it. And they are perfect for destroying low-flying aircraft, especially helicopters. So the Russians got themselves into a problem. Actually, two problems. First, they had to fly low because of the Ukrainian air defense system, but as soon as they flew low, they were hit by Ukrainian man pads, and everything went downhill from there. And one of the major reasons the Ukrainian forces were not pummeled into oblivion in Donbass was because of the air defense network the Ukrainians had utilized. So the Russians could do little but sit back and take it. They did fly sorties, but they flew them very limitedly. Why? Because Ukraine had air defense and they used it. Now here's the crazy part. The Ukrainian Air Force had a little over 220 aircraft at the beginning of the war in 2022. At that same time, Russia had almost 4,000 aircraft. That is almost a 1 to 20 difference in favor of Russia. And yet they still did not control the skies. Now remember that I told you during the NATO intervention in Yugoslavia, in the 10 weeks of that conflict, NATO flew over 38,000 combat missions? Well, in the first 6 months of Russia's war in Ukraine, they flew 20,000 sorties, but fewer than 3,000 of these entered Ukrainian airspace, likely due to the fear of Ukraine's sustained air defense. So NATO flew more than 10 times the amount of combat missions in 10 weeks than Russia was able to fly in 6 months. Now people will take that and be like, oh, the Russian Air Force must suck. No, that's not what you should be taking out of this entire picture. The conclusion that should be formulated is the power of air defense systems. You can have the best pilot and the best aircraft with the best training, but if he gets hit by an air defense missile, he will be incinerated. No amount of training mitigates the consequences of an anti-air missile getting in contact with human flesh. It doesn't matter how good the pilot is. It doesn't matter how good the aircraft is. If you get hit by an anti-air missile, you're done. Most of the time. That is the power of air defense. So the Ukrainians use this network to keep the Russians at bay throughout the entire war. And it's worked phenomenally. No Russian pilot wants to get lost in the skies of Ukraine. In fact, Russian pilots in Ukraine are having to use civilian GPS units taped to the dashboards of their planes. They don't want to get lost because if they leave Mother Russia and get lost in the skies of Ukraine, they're going to miss out on their borscht for supper. But all jokes aside, they don't want to get lost in Ukraine. The Russians are estimated to have lost at least 80 aircraft in this entire conflict. And while that doesn't sound like a lot, keep in mind the Russians are not doing a lot of sorties in Ukraine to begin with because of fear of the air defense network. So the Ukrainians have done a very good job. The problem is, this way of doing air defense is not going to work for Ukraine in the long run. In fact, it's already starting to fail. There's multiple reasons why this Ukrainian mode of operations with their air defense just is not going to work. It won't work for long. We're going to talk about 3 reasons. Reason number 1. The Russians got smart. Instead of using aircraft to go probe the Ukrainian skies and look for the weak spots, the Russians begin to fire missiles. Literally, Russian aircraft will be in Russian airspace, fire a missile, and the missile travels into Ukrainian airspace, and then it probes for the Ukrainian air defense. If the missile gets shot down, the Russians know exactly where Ukrainian air defense system is at. If it doesn't and hits its target, well, that spot's weak and will be exploited in the future. It's better to lose a missile that costs $100,000 than to lose a plane that costs $3 million. I left the pilot out of there because the Russians don't seem to show too much concern for their pilots. This shift in Russian strategy seemed to come in late fall 2022. When Russians began mass missile attacks against Ukrainian infrastructure, particularly Ukrainians' energy infrastructure. Here's how the Russian strategy seems to be working. Okay, now let me introduce you to 2 characters I'm going to use to illustrate this point. On the Ukrainian side, we have Colonel Revsky, and on the Russian side, we have Lieutenant Fedor. Lieutenant Fedor is sick of his planes getting shot down by Ukrainian air defense, so he comes up with a brilliant idea. Instead of sending 3 planes to probe Ukrainian air defenses, I'm going to fire 50 missiles. One of his friends looks up to him and asks, Fedor, why would you fire 50 missiles? What if they don't hit their target? What if they're intercepted? Fedor explains that the very purpose of this operation is to probe for the Ukrainian weak spots and to exhaust their air defense. Fedor reasons that if he fires enough missiles at important locations, Ukraine will will be forced to fire their air defense missiles, thus revealing their locations and also degrading the number of missiles they have. Fedor is fully confident in Russia's ability to fight a war of attrition, and while he's busy reveling in the potential success of his plan, Colonel Revsky is in a totally different scenario. He's heard from his intelligence that the Russians have a different strategy this time, and he doesn't really know what it is. So Colonel Revsky orders his guys, the guys part of his air defense group, to be on high alert. All of a sudden, notification comes in. Sir, we have dozens of missiles flying at Kyiv. What should we do? Colonel Revsky hardly has time to think. He orders his air defense S-300 to engage the missiles. His unit open fires, alerting the other unit to open fire as well. The S-300 missiles roar towards Fedor's attack missiles. As the offensive and defensive missiles meet in the sky, some of the Russian missiles fall like dead flies. The Ukrainian command begins to cheer until they realize a slight problem. Their air defense systems cannot handle all the missiles the Russians have fired. Now I'm going to pause the story real quick. I don't know the average of how many rockets Ukraine intercepts out of the ones the Russians fire, but let's just be slightly comical and take President Zelensky's for the Ukrainian interception. It seems like almost every time Russia launches a massive airstrike on Ukraine, Zelensky claims intercepted 90 to 95% of all the rockets that were fired. Let's be kind to his side and we'll just say he knocks out 90% of them. So Revsky and his Ukrainian air defense men are able to knock out 90% of the 50 missiles fired. The problem with that is 5 of the missiles still hit their mark. Revsky is horrified as 3 Ukrainian S-300 launchers are wiped out, and the other 2 Russian missiles strike Ukrainian ammo depots. Back at the Russian command, Fedor sees things rise up in smoke. He knows some of his missiles have been down, maybe even most of them, but Fedor is okay with that. He is willing to lose 45 missiles to knock out 3 Ukrainian air defense systems. Why? Because Russia can produce missiles much more than Ukraine can. They have a bigger population and a bigger labor force. Ukraine only has a limited amount of air defense systems, especially launchers. Fedor has now found his plan. Slowly but surely, he will erode Ukraine's air defense capacity by knocking out launchers and forcing the Ukrainians to use lots of missiles. What I just described to you is basically the Russian strategy with these mass missile strikes they've been carrying out. The Russians are well aware that Ukraine does not have the capacity to fight a war of attrition with Russia, and that's why they're doing that. That's why they'll launch so many missiles and have so many intercepted, but yet persist in this strategy. That's reason number 1. Ukraine can't fight a war of attrition with Russia. Russia can produce more. Why? Russia has more people and Russia has a bigger defense industry. Ukraine's going to have to find another way to deal with a threat in the sky. The second reason has little to do with Russia's actual production capacity. This is when the most lovely democracy in the world, the Islamic Republic of Iran, has given Russia thousands of cheap Shahed drones. The Shahed drone is a loitering munition. In other words, it's a kamikaze drone. It's meant to crash into something and destroy it. Russia bought thousands of these from Iran. How is that possible? These things are very affordable as the drone can be as cheap as $10,000. Imagine this. You're Russia. You don't want to have your aircraft knocked out of the sky just to probe Ukrainian air defense systems. You've begun to use missiles on the Ukrainians, but that's costing you money. I mean, if the cheapest missile you have is $25,000 and the most expensive one can be almost $1 million, you fire enough of those, you're going to be having some financial problems in the military. So the trick is acquire cheaper equipment, yet maintain the same deadly effect that you had previously. And that's when your buddy Iran steps in. He's like, hey bro, listen, okay, if you help me out with my righteous war against the West and my own political interests that are totally right and have no intentions for harm of other countries in any way, then I'll give you these cheap drones. In fact, they're only $10,000, but bruh, since we're such loving pals, I'll give you a discount on it. You can take those drones and, terrorize the population of Ukraine and destroy their air defense system at the same time. And it makes perfect sense in the Russians' head, so yeah, totally, it's a done deal. Russia and Iran shake hands, and the guys who run the Ukrainian air defense quiver in their boots because they know they're about to get attacked with thousands of drones. Now, I already know that someone's going to ask this question. Well, if Russia bought thousands of Iranian drones and Ukraine has limited air defense, then why don't the Ukrainians just not intercept the drones? I mean, a drone can't be that damaging, can it? 1 drone may be tolerable. 2, 3, maybe even 10. 3,000 are a totally different story. And trust me, have 3,000 unmanned objects with missiles fly into your city, and you'll be understanding quite well why the Ukrainians are intercepting them. The problem with the Ukrainians attempting to combat these drones is they're extremely cheap, therefore Russia has so many of them, while an air defense missile is not cheap. So in the late fall, early winter, Ukrainian cities were getting pummeled by these drones. To kind of illustrate the deadly effect these drones have, let's go back to our 2 military men on both sides, Fedor and Revsky. Now Revsky is back next to what's left of his air defense unit, and he hears the news that Russia has purchased some drones from Iran. Revsky kind of chuckles to himself. They're just drones. Come on, you can shoot these things down with guns. Why would we actually need to intercept them? Revsky is about to have his confident theory tested, and he's about to find out, unfortunately, that it's wrong. Back on the Russian side, Fedor has a grim smile on his face. He just got a package of 150 Shahed-136 drones, and he can't wait to aim these things straight at the Ukrainians. He gives the order, and all 150 of them take off. Back on the Ukrainian side of things, Revsky is about to have the scare of his life. His radar detects that something's flying towards him, but it can't be a missile. It's traveling too slow to be a missile, and there's multiple of these things on his radar. But not just 1, 2, or 3. 20 drones are aimed at his position. He orders his men to intercept them with their combat arms. AK-47s and 74s begin blasting up in the sky. And they're partially successful. These Iranian drones are not the talk of legend, and they are cheap. So, 7 of them fall. The problem is, there's 13 more coming. And they're coming at speeds of about 115 miles per hour, straight at the Ukrainian air defense. In panic, Revsky orders the air defense S-300 to fire. S-300 missiles were not made for drones. They do fire, though, and take out 8 of the Shahed-136 drones. The problem is, 5 more hit their mark and destroy another Ukrainian S-300 system. Let's do the math on that hypothetical scenario real quick. Russia lost 15 drones that didn't make their mark. That cost them around $150,000. But 5 of them did hit their mark. The problem is an S-300 missile system can cost $1 million or more. Russia loses $150,000 worth of drones that don't hit their mark. However, 5 of them do, and Ukraine loses an element to $1 million or more system. People always point out the S-300's entire system is not just one launcher. That's true, but take away the launcher and the rockets aren't going to jump in the sky without a push. So without the launcher, the system is basically ineffective. You see what I'm saying here? Ukraine cannot continue to depend on that air defense system because not only are the Russians firing dozens upon dozens of missiles at them with the goal of exhausting their air defense capability, they were also launching hundreds of drones at them, again with the goal of exhausting their air defense capability. Most of Ukraine's S-300 launchers were likely either destroyed or damaged, and that's why NATO was in such a rush to get them air defense systems. The third reason Ukraine's current air defense way of fighting won't work anymore is because of the depleted state of Ukraine's air defense forces. Because Ukraine's air defense forces are now severely depleted and attrited, Russia is now more willing to fly their aircraft directly into Ukrainian airspace to probe Ukrainian weaknesses in their air defense. With missiles coming at them, drones coming at them, and now Russian aircraft coming at them, Ukraine is going to have to change this way of conducting air defense. And this is when Ukraine's big friends come in. Have you ever seen one of those fights where a little guy's getting pummeled by some big dude? The big dude's pummeling him and beating him up. And then all of a sudden, he whistles real quick and 12 guys show up. Some are bigger, some are smaller, but 12 guys, 24 fists, the bully's in trouble. NATO's not just going to let Ukraine sit there and get pummeled. So this is when they step in by giving their aid. The United States has given Ukraine at least 2 Patriot air defense systems. And they've also given them, and Norway and the US have also worked out a deal where they gave Ukraine one of their NASAMs. NASAM simply stands for Norwegian Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System, also known as National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System. Okay. Alright, we're almost done. Not to mention that Ukraine is also going to get other European air defense systems. And make no mistake, these European air defense systems are likely just as deadly as their American counterparts. So, NATO gives these air defense systems to Ukraine. And Russia, well, they obviously aren't too happy. Russia sees NATO giving these air defense systems to Ukraine, and being the loving neighbor and the friendly, dependable ally that Russia is, Russia decides to wipe these air defense systems off the map. US air defense systems arrive, and they're soon put to the test. Just recently, Russia launched a massive attack on Kyiv, firing over a dozen missiles. The goal of this Russian attack was likely to target the Patriot battery itself. This attack included Russian hypersonic Kinzhal missiles. Ukraine claimed to down 6 Russian hypersonic missiles along with many others, and they claimed that the Patriot battery was not destroyed. Because obviously the goal of this assault was the US Patriot battery sent to Ukraine, and if it was destroyed, that'll be a massive PR blow for Ukraine and a massive PR boost for the Russians. Again, Ukraine claimed it was not destroyed. They claimed they downed 6 Russian Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. If you have any ties to President Zelensky, please tell him to define what hypersonic means. I mean, I get he has to lie because he's the president of a country in a war, but I think if he knew the definition of hypersonic, he'd construct his lies a little better. To suggest that the Patriot system intercepted 6 hypersonic missiles, in my opinion, is just simply laughable. That's such a big pill to swallow, the US Pentagon wasn't even swallowing that pill. Have you ever seen somebody make such a fool out of themselves that their friends begin to distance themselves because of what they're saying? That's pretty much what happened here. Ukraine claims to down 6 of the Kinzhal missiles, and the United States Pentagon doesn't even want to comment on it. The Russians, of course, in their total honesty, they claim they destroyed the Patriot. However, the United States did say the Patriot may have been damaged, quote unquote may. When the Pentagon says may about something negative about itself, you can take that as a yes. The Patriot was most likely damaged. I wouldn't take the Russian claim for it being destroyed, but it was damaged. And this proves that the Russians are after those Patriots. They're after Ukraine's new air defenses from the West. And it looks like they're following the same strategy they did before. Overwhelm these air defense systems with multiple missiles. With one Patriot battery likely damaged, that means the Ukrainians only have one more that's undamaged. The Russians are going to keep doing this until they destroy those Patriot defense systems. And forget the idea that Russia's running out of missiles. The media has been saying Russia's running out of missiles since the first month of the war. And here we are over a year later, and they're still firing the missiles. But I will tell you this, if it was as easy for Russia to create missiles as it was for the media to lie, there will be no Patriot battery. So the Russians are going to try to destroy the Ukrainian air defense systems. They're going to try to find a weak spot and exploit it. And that's why NATO is going to have to do more. NATO is going to have to send more air defense systems. But they're also going to have to do something else. They're going to have to send more jets. If the Ukrainians don't have jets, they're still going to be victim to hundreds of Russian missile and drone attacks. NATO needs to stop forcing Ukraine to be reactive and give them the ability to be proactive. Give them jets. If NATO really wants them to win. So yes, without the jets, without more air defense system, Ukraine's going to be in trouble. But if they get these things, Ukraine can turn the tide against Russia. That's all I have for you today. Be sure to subscribe to the channel to get more in-depth analysis like this about the Ukraine war and find out what's really going on. God bless you, and I'll catch you next time.